With the coming of spring 1944, the winter stalemate in Italy was broken. Our forces slowly resumed fighting their way up the west coast of the Italian boot toward Rome against bitter German opposition. The British advanced up the east coast in the face of equally bitter opposition. In the Pacific, troops of the 1st Cavalry Division landed on both Manos and Los Negros Islands in the Admiralty Group to wipe out all Japanese resistance and complete occupation of the entire group of islands. We landed large forces at Hollandia and Ikapa off the north coast of New Guinea. General Stilwell and his troops were fighting the Japanese in Burma. This was global warfare on a scale never known before. Less than 3 years before, Hitler had addressed the Reichstag.
Germany, Italy, and Japan will wage common war upon the United States to a victorious conclusion.
In Rome, his fascist partner had declared,
Fascist Italy and National Socialist Germany, ever closely linked, participate from today on the side of heroic Japan against the United States.
A Japanese militarist joined the derisive chorus.
Americans have radios, automobiles, big beefsteaks. When a people has those things, they don't want to fight. Americans won't sleep in hammocks or lie in trenches. They are like a tiger whose stomach is full. They are sleepy.
The American is no soldier.
The American, no soldier. Yet there he was, carrying the fight to the boastful aggressors. The self-proclaimed Superman was learning to his bitter surprise and sorrow the fighting qualities of the American soldier. It seemed the aggressors had made a slight miscalculation.
In Italy, our forces pushed on through rain and mud, over mountains, across rivers, toward Rome. Our power drive up the Italian boot forced the enemy to divert 30 of his divisions from France and the Low Countries, weakening his defenses along the English Channel coast, where our invasion of France was soon to come. We now had an army numbering millions of soldiers. We now had 150,000 armored vehicles as compared to the 29 tanks the Army had in 1940. 400,000 artillery pieces were now engaged in the war effort compared to the 235 available in 1940. From a 1940 production capacity of 117 aircraft a month, we were now producing 9,000 planes of all types a month, a plane every 5 minutes, 12 an hour. Here now was an air arm of 150,000 planes, supporting the coordinated Allied effort to wipe out enemy industry, supply routes, and communication facilities. The American tiger, grown sleepy on a full stomach, or so the Japanese had thought, was now fully awake, lean, and fighting in the jungles. On the 4th of June, 1944, our Fifth Army captured Rome. It was a military victory, yes, but its psychological effect carried the greater impact throughout the world, for it was the first Axis capital to fall into our hands, bringing consternation and foreboding to the enemy, and fresh heart and rejoicing to the free world and its fighting forces. In England, after months of planning and preparation, it was D-Day -2. General Eisenhower was about to unleash the most massive amphibious invasion in history. During the big buildup, England had become a vast staging area for troops and the materiel of war. Thousands of vehicles and ready-to-be assembled combat-type aircraft. 20,000 railroad cars and 1,000 locomotives. 20 million square feet of covered storage and shop space. 44 million square feet of open storage space to hold the growing volume of supplies, wire, tires, bombs, shells, and other explosive devices. Awaiting invasion port embarkation were thousands of trucks and support vehicles. Row upon row of tanks. Wide range of artillery weapons. 170 miles of new railroad had been constructed to haul more than 2 million tons of supplies and combat hardware to the invasion ports. The United States Army had constructed 163 airfields in England for the Allied planes that were systematically bombing Germany day and night. The invasion directive issued by the combined chiefs of staff was concise. General Eisenhower had his orders.
You will enter the continent of Europe and, in conjunction with the other Allied nations, undertake operations aimed at the heart of Germany and the destruction of her armed forces.
Another American general was to have a central role in complying with that monumental order. General Omar N. Bradley, field commander of American forces. D-Day -1. Invasion forces began embarking in England. Destination, Normandy. Involved in this massive amphibious invasion were some 3 million soldiers, sailors, and airmen. 4,000 ships and boats. 20,000 vehicles of all types, and an endless list of combat support weapons. Operation Overlord, the code name for the invasion, was close at hand. Now, as D-Day and H-Hour approached, the final logistical operation was underway. In the darkness before dawn on June 6, 1944, the great invasion began to unfold. 17,000 men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, with over 2 million pounds of combat equipment and supplies, were airlifted to carefully selected drop zones behind the invasion beaches, where they were dropped to secure key road junctions and other strategic terrain objectives. The invasion armada, the largest ever assembled, was now in position off the coast of France. While our assault forces prepared for H-Hour, Allied naval power began their concentrated shore bombardment. This was amphibious warfare on a scale that staggered the imagination. Nothing like it had ever been seen. At Omaha Beach, in the first assault, 30,000 American troops stormed ashore. British and Canadian forces struck at 3 different beach sectors. At Utah Beach, 20,000 American troops were landed. By the end of the first day, our invasion force ashore totaled 120,000 men. With every passing hour, with each passing day, reinforcements streamed ashore to enlarge the beachhead with tanks, trucks, ammunition, and supplies. Hundreds of our attack bombers and fighters were now over Europe carrying payloads of destruction aimed at the vital centers of Hitler's fortress Europe. In heavy formations cascaded 3,500 tons of explosives, a ton every second, upon Nazi-held positions. Our massed bomber formations were now given a canopy of protective air support by P-38 Lightnings. Together, they fought off enemy air attacks. As the roar of engines and concussion of the bombs were still ringing in the ears of a dazed and battered enemy, our ground artillery opened up. Our tanks and infantry rolled forward, driving west to isolate Brest and other ports on the peninsula. Other elements pushed south and east toward Paris.
In the Pacific, the islands of Saipan and Tinian were taken by the Marines in separate amphibious assaults. The Imperial Japanese fleet sortied to the defense of these vital islands and was dealt another shattering blow in the swirling air battle that became known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. As soon as these islands were secure, massive air bases sprang up as American B-29 bombers prepared for an all-out aerial assault on the Japanese homeland. In early August of 1944, Guam was recaptured in a fierce assault.
What was left of 10 German divisions was mopped up by the very men their Fuhrer had told them were not soldiers and would not fight. Again, the aggressor had made a slight miscalculation. As the Germans were meeting disaster in northwestern France, the United States 7th Army, combat-hardened veterans of the fighting in Italy, hit the beaches in southern France on the morning of August 15th. During that day, 50,000 men and their equipment were landed. The American 6th Army Corps pushed north along the Rhone River Valley. And other troops moved eastward toward the Italian border. The drive into the heart of France was deeper now. Patton's 3rd Army angled toward points just east and south of Paris. The 1st Army flanking the 3rd. The 7th now was moving up swiftly from the south. After the landings in southern France, Paris was liberated after 4 years of Nazi occupation. The liberation of Paris, like the liberation of Rome less than 3 months before, was a cause for rejoicing, and its psychological effect was reflected throughout the free world. Among our troops, who paraded so proudly down the Champs-Élysées, were some whose fathers had followed the same flag down that famous avenue a quarter of a century before, celebrating another victory, which they too had won in the best traditions of the American fighting man, and who had come there not for conquest, but to liberate. But the men of our fighting forces knew it was only one more important milestone along the rugged road to victory. Allied armies held bridgeheads all along the line of the Seine. In the south of France, they captured Toulon and Marseille. The British and Canadians took Brussels and the great port of Antwerp.
In a bold...
The 1st American Army pushed across the border into Belgium and drove on to Liège. The 3rd took Verdun. The 3rd, having crossed the Meuse River, reached the Moselle. Now the Allied front ran on a line all the way from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Seventh Army patrols coming up from the south met patrols from the 3rd Army. The two armies were now linked up for the coordinated offensive to come. Retreat for Nazi forces caught on the wrong side of the line was cut off. we rounded up our share of prisoners. The desperate plight of Hitler's armies became more apparent as the bewildered legions of a once mighty, destructive force found themselves defeated by an army they had been repeatedly told would never last on the soil of the Third Reich longer than 9 hours. In the 97 days since the 5th Corps had led the assault on Omaha Beach, it had come nearly 500 miles and now drove across the German border and stood on the soil of Hitler's Germany. Who was it that once said, "The American was no soldier"?
The immensity of global war as it occurred at the height of World War II staggers the imagination. On the ground, jungles and swamps, in mountains, in forests, and on the plains, millions of men scattered around the world, locked in combat. In the air, thousands of others with their bombing and fighting aircraft. And on the seas and beneath, other thousands with surface ships and submarines. Incredibly long supply lines with mountains of material to transport. Vast communication networks stretching around the earth. It was the greatest concerted organization of military might in the history of the world. In Burma, General Joseph Stilwell's command of American, British, and Chinese jungle fighters were driving back the Japanese. Opening the way for the Lido Road, which our Army engineers were building as the ground supply route to the embattled Chinese by way of India. In Russia, German armies were in retreat before massive Soviet counterattacks. Everywhere, the Allies were clobbering the enemy, but it was no grand march, no sudden sweep to victory.
Our armies were battering at the gates of the Nazi homeland. General Hodges' First Army drove through the vaunted Siegfried Line, mile upon mile of concrete fortification and anti-tank emplacements through the city of Aachen. Years and 7 months after General MacArthur had left the Philippines, he kept his promise to return. On the 20th of October, 1944, his forces invaded the island of Leyte. This, too, was to be no easy parade to victory. Our soldiers were to face an enemy who would fight as their leaders ordered them to fight, to the death. They wanted it that way. They were to get what they asked for. 7 days after MacArthur landed on Leyte, the United States 3rd and 7th Fleets dealt the Japanese Navy its death blow in the battle for the Leyte Gulf. The curtain was rising on the last fast-moving act of the drama of World War II. General Patton's Third Army took Metz. Ahead was the nearby Saar Basin, Germany's second most important industrial district. On the other side of the world, Army B-29 bombers from new bases on Saipan showered bombs on Tokyo, a fiery rain from the heavens to avenge Pearl Harbor. The campaign on Leyte was going well as our forces moved on, capturing the Japanese base at Ormoc along the west coast. Other forces landed on Mindoro Island with no losses. While General MacArthur's forces were driving forward in the Philippines, Patton's Third Army penetrated the Saar and drove on across the Saar River. A record-breaking fleet of 1,600 United States heavy bombers blasted Frankfurt and other German cities. The Nazis were reaping a bitter and devastating harvest from the seeds they had once sown from the air. Now the very perpetrators of aerial Blitzkrieg saw their own cities reduced to rubble. To the millions of Nazi war victims, here at last was a measure of retribution against their merciless executioners. Some of the bitterest fighting of the war took place on the Cologne Plain. Our push toward the industrial Ruhr was resisted every step of the way. Then, on the 16th of December, 1944, the German counteroffensive struck. German Field Marshal von Rundstedt suddenly sent a dozen elite divisions smashing into the Ardennes sector. Von Rundstedt had cast the dice for high stakes, crossing the Meuse River, driving toward Liège, and trying to cut the Allied communication line from Antwerp to the front lines. If our lines of communication could be cut, the fate of our armies might be in the balance. This was the Battle of the Bulge. Combat and non-combat troops were suddenly and necessarily fighting side by side in worsening winter weather. Grabbing their weapons, they dug in and responded to the old military axiom of hanging on to buy time until reinforcements would come. General Eisenhower took immediate action to meet the crisis. He put the 1st and 9th Armies north of the Bulge under command of Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group, with orders to attack from the north. Patton's Third Army was to attack from the south. Two airborne divisions were rushed in. the 101st was ordered to hold the vital communication center at Bastogne. It was during this action in besieged Bastogne that General McAuliffe, who was then commanding the 101st, made his famous reply to the German demand that he surrender. That reply was reportedly one word long: nuts. If the enemy did not immediately understand the meaning of McAuliffe's typical American reply, the action which followed undoubtedly convinced him that it meant that the Americans had no intention of surrendering. Just 6 days after von Rundstedt had launched his counteroffensive, elements of Patton's Third Army, racing up from the south, struck the German on his southern flank. The pressure was off the 101st Airborne. The 1st American Army attacked from the north. After the British struck the Bulge on the west, the Third Army smashed on north to link up with the First Army. Then the weather cleared, and our planes took to the air, blasting von Rundstedt's forces. Was soon over. The enemy was retreating. The Germans had thrown their last big Sunday punch of the war. While the Battle of the Bulge was going on in Europe, the 8th Army, commanded by General Robert L. Eichelberger, was battling stiff Japanese resistance on Leyte in the Pacific. The fight for Leyte would continue for months, until nearly 50,000 fanatical Japanese would be annihilated. Our forces were spreading out in the Philippines. 6th Army troops landed on Luzon in the Lingayen Gulf and swept southward to capture Tarlac, only 65 miles from Manila. "15 days later, men of the 1st Cavalry Division fought their way into Manila. The capture of Manila included the Santo Tomas prison camp. Along with the Filipino people, these prisoners had waited in long and quiet agony for this moment of liberation. Of all the liberated peoples in the world, none showed more gratitude than did the Filipinos. They well knew we had come not for conquest, but to keep a solemn promise to return and destroy the aggressor, who had taken over their homeland in a war of conquest. Less than 2 years later, the Philippines would be given complete independence as a sovereign nation by the United States. 14 days after the fall of Manila, our airborne troops landed on Corregidor. 2 years and 9 months after the Japanese had hauled down our flag. It had been a long and bloody road, but we had returned. And where were those who once had said the American was no soldier, that he would not fight? All around the world, climactic events were swiftly gaining momentum. Our Ninth Army, under General Simpson, crossed the Rhine on the 2nd of March. 4 days later, General Hodge's First Army occupied Cologne. 4 days after that, 300 of our superfortresses blasted Tokyo.
U.S. Marines storm ashore on the volcanic island of Iwo Jima, seizing the blasted volcanic island in a hard and bloody fight. And wounded B-29s were making emergency landings.
By the 17th of the same month, General Patton's Third Army had taken Koblenz. The next day, and half a world away, our troops invaded Panay Island in the central Philippines. 3 days after that, Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine. 4 days later, General Eichelberger's Eighth Army was landing on Cebu in the Philippines. Less than a week after that, on the 1st of April, 1945, the United States 10th Army, under General Simon Buckner, invaded Okinawa. On the 11th of the same month, the 2nd Armored Division of the 9th Army reached the Elbe, only 63 miles from Berlin. The 3rd captured Coburg. On the 12th of April, death took the Commander-in-Chief, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He had lived to see the triumphant advances of American arms, but fate had denied him the satisfaction that final victory would bring. Less than a month after President Roosevelt's death, Germany surrendered. Hitler was dead by his own hand. Only a few days before, Mussolini had been killed by Italian partisans. To his home shores, General Eisenhower returned in triumph. But in the Pacific, a war was still going on. A big and bitterly fought war, with the end not yet in sight. Okinawa was a bloody battleground, as our 10th Army was finding out. It took us 82 days of continuous fighting to take Okinawa. All the military might of the United States would now be concentrated on the Japanese homeland. A tough job lay ahead, a job that would take men and equipment. Our entire military strength was now aimed at the one remaining Axis partner. Our military planners estimated that in an all-out assault upon Japan itself, our invasion forces would probably suffer 1.5 million casualties.
On August the 6th, 2 days before the Russians said they would attack the Japanese, the Enola Gay took off on its 1,500-mile journey.
But a new and terrifying force had come into the world, which was to prevent those 1.5 million casualties, the atomic bomb. 2 of these awesome weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought Japan to her knees.
It was 2 days before the Japanese government realized what the atomic bomb was and what it had done. 70,000 had died in Hiroshima. Another 70,000 were injured. 97% of the city's buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. President Truman, on hearing the news, called it the greatest thing in history. The peace group in the Japanese cabinet hoped that the bomb might persuade the war faction to accept surrender. As the cabinet met on the morning of August 9th, it received further shattering news. That same morning, the Americans had dropped a plutonium bomb on Nagasaki. It killed 60,000 people. But even now, the Japanese militants held out for surrender without an occupation. The peace party wanted only to preserve the emperor's position. The war had ended, but not the dying. Radiation sickness, which the Americans had not foreseen, would kill thousands more in years to come.